Okay, so I started recording the webinar. From this point on, everything that's said will be captured in that recording. I'm just going to give you guys a quick introduction here. This webinar series, the ALSA Tools for Municipalities webinar series, grew out of a recognition that ALSA, or the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, has some great tools, tremendous potential for municipalities. I'm just going to see if I can help Matthew with his audio problems in just a second. Seems like it might just be specific to Matthew. If it is, we'll see if he can get that sorted on his end. Sorry about the delay here, folks. I just want to make sure that everybody who has logged on has access to the sound. It's a little bit difficult to follow without the sound. Okay, so this series, like I said, grew out of there's a couple of people it looks like are having issues. I'm just going to suggest they try logging out and logging back in. Okay, when we have this issue where it's just audio for a couple of people, it's generally the way that they have logged in, so we'll keep going. There's a series, and has been noted before, there were a couple of presentations before. Last week was transfer of development credits, and the week before that was conservation easements. Today we've got Jason Unger from the Environmental Law Center who's going to be speaking about conservation directives. All of this is part of a series that we're able to put on because of contribution by the Max Bell Foundation and Anonymous Foundation to a larger project that Jason and the Environmental Law Center, as well as AUMA and AMDC, have put together. It's called Community Conserve, and this is one of the projects out of Community Conserve that we'll be launching this spring. The idea with Community Conserve is that it's a forum for Alberta municipal staff, managers, councillors to post their environmental conservation issues or concerns, and then vote on the priority issues as a community, and then crowdfund the efforts to address the ones that rise as the most common issues. And so we created 5 catalyst projects, we call them, to try and demonstrate what they could produce, and this webinar series is one of those. But this webinar in particular is on conservation directives, and like I said, it's going to be given to you by Jason Unger, who I'll pass it over to in just a second. Jason is the Executive Director of the Environmental Law Center and has a pretty robust history in these kinds of conservation issues. He's worked on law and policies related to conservation for municipal planning law, private lands, water law, and has been doing that for over a decade. He's produced a bunch of guidance documents and policy reviews for tools that are enabled under the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, and has worked a lot with land trusts and private land conservation organizations in the province. He sits on the Alberta Water Council, has been on several other nonprofit boards, including the Land Stewardship Centre of Canada, Water Matters Society, and he's currently a member of the City of Edmonton Environmental Advisory Committee. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jason to talk to you about conservation directives.
Thanks, Guy. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay as well. If not, just flag and maybe Guy will intervene. As we go through, if you do have any questions, I'm going to let Guy kind of moderate any questions that come up. If they're more of a discussion point, we'll probably wait till the end of the presentation. Otherwise, we'll jump right in on any questions relevant to the specific slide. So I'm here to talk to you about conservation directives as one of the tools that was enabled under the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. You'll see that my title is An Unknown Hope. I think of conservation directives, it kind of brings my mind in the nerdy way that I am to the Prime Directive of Star Trek. So there's a bit of a Star Trek theme
Jason,
through this presentation. Yes. Okay.
I
You can
don't want
hardly
to
hear me.
interrupt, but there's a couple of comments about volume.
Okay, I'm gonna
There's some
turn
folks who
up.
are saying they can't hear you.
Okay, I'm gonna move closer to my computer. Is that any better now? Hopefully that's better. Check my volume here, and guess I should. I'll certainly try and speak up as much as possible to ensure the volumes. As I was just mentioning, there's a bit of a Star Trek theme to this, and so we might have a skill testing question at the end of the presentation for all those Trekkies out there. So we'll proceed from here. So conservation directives. It is a bit of an unknown tool and an unknown hope. Um, so we'll see what I mean by that in the coming slides. Oops, used to using the computer and not the screen here. So who is the Environmental Law Center? The Environmental Law Center is basically an organization, a nonprofit organization that started in 1982. We have a vision of a society where laws secure an environment that sustains current and future generations. As you'll see there, this is one of the documents that we had produced with the help of Sarah Palmer and Adam Dredzik. And it kind of flushes out some of the issues around conservation directives and proposes a way forward. And this presentation is largely resulted from that. So we'll proceed on. If you have any questions about the ELC at all, please feel free to contact me directly. So, what was the purpose of conservation directives? To boldly go where no provincial government has gone before and conserve our natural environment with some cash. So there's obviously a variety of issues at play here. Conservation directives were a result of the land use framework process that really got underway in the mid-2000s and concluded in 2008. One of the main strategies of the land use framework was to develop a strategy for conservation and stewardship on private and public lands. As part of that, we certainly saw a variety of issues that were impacting private and public lands that needed to be dealt with. Coordination of minerals and surface activity, so the whole issue around the government issuing tenure to minerals and the resulting impacts and conflicts on surface. Agricultural land fragmentation and conservation, or conversion, and conversely, conservation of agricultural lands is an ongoing concern, particularly around some of our prime agricultural lands. We've seen a lot of loss around that, and we needed to look to mechanisms to deal with that. Recreational use of public land. Access is a hot topic. Obviously, with the designation of the castle, there's a variety of concerns and interests at play in terms of recreation on public lands, and specifically around off-highway vehicle use. There's also a variety of infrastructure concerns that were raised, and in terms of utility corridors, there's been quite a bit of conflict over the years around electrical generation and transportation corridors that needed to be resolved as well. Many would argue that way back when the special areas process went through, there wasn't significant enough conservation of ecological areas as well. And then certainly relevant to municipal governments and the concept of environmental reserves, the overlap with the provincial government around flood risk management, which certainly since 2008 has garnered a lot more attention and relevance to both municipal development, but also to provincial regulation. So the land use framework gave way to the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, which was passed in 2009. Amendments to that act following some contentious and highly kind of media-driven discussions around private land and the centralized process that the Alberta Land Stewardship Act really developed. Obviously, we had the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, or LARP, approved in 2012. The South Saskatchewan Regional Plan was approved in 2015 and was just amended to reflect that discussion I mentioned, or that designation of the Cashel region. And then that North Saskatchewan Regional Plan is still waiting approval, or at least the Regional Advisory Council advice is awaiting approval. So we still have a long way to go. There's many regions that haven't had a regional plan developed yet. So there's a lot of question marks about how the Land Stewardship Act tools can be used in the interim, and questions about how regional plans can be implemented through the use of these tools. So as Guy had mentioned, there's a variety of land stewardship tools available under the Land Stewardship Act: conservation easements, tradable development credits, offsets, the concept of conservation banking, and what we're talking about today, conservation directives. So somebody had noted in the hopefully no red shirts die. Well, I'm afraid perhaps legislation sent them out never to return. Are conservation directives the red shirts of regulation and policy? That question remains to be seen. For those who are not Trekkies, the red shirts are notorious for those being sent to the planets first as a reconnaissance, and they seem to always get killed. So if you're ever given a red shirt as a Star Trek member, that's a bad sign. The conservation and stewardship policy is also missing in action. So the question does become, has the government, both this current government and the previous government, kind of sent this tool out the door and then kind of abandoned it? And it's a very valid question to this day. So what do conservation directives, and I shorten it often to CD, how do they approach conservation issues in the province? It's basically a provincially based land use zoning process, which can be imposed and which relates or provides the right to apply for compensation. So we have to wonder, what is the role of government versus organizations such as land trusts or private entities and municipalities in terms of conservation of lands? The language of the Conservation Directive in the Land Stewardship Act is quite interesting. It focuses on permanently protecting, conserving, managing, and enhancing a variety of values. And as you can see by both the protect, conserve, manage, and enhance, it's very flexible, very kind of undefined. You can almost imagine, well, management could be anything. Similarly, the values that are sought to be preserved are very broad. They're environmental, they could be aesthetic, they could be agricultural. So this is a very open-ended tool, and there haven't been really many regulations or policies, none to speak of, that really allow us to decide how they should be used. They have to be expressly declared to be established in a regional plan. And that means that the precise nature and the purpose of these conservation directives and their intention have to be described in the regional plan itself. Also, the land to which the conservation directive applies has to be identified, or a prescribed means of identifying those lands, which is an interesting notion, have to be identified in the regional plan itself. So they are quite onerous in terms of what you have to include in the regional plan itself, although there is some leeway in terms of how you identify them specifically. Interestingly, they are not an estate or interest in land, so it is basically a regulatory tool which is imposed by the provincial government. I say imposed now, but I would argue that we should be really viewing these things as voluntary measures where we can work together towards conservation goals that we all have. In terms of the process, effectively, once a CD or a conservation directive is described in a regional plan, there's notice to the title holder of that land. And as we'll discuss in the next couple of slides, which are text heavy, basically identifying some of the process involved in conservation directives, title holder is quite broadly defined. You then apply to government to determine whether there's compensation there's an entitlement to compensation. And there's a variety of mechanisms to deal with that, either through the Land Compensation Board, or if you prefer, you can go to the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench. And then there's an appeal process to the Court of Appeal if you went to the Land Compensation Board. These next couple of slides, as I've mentioned, are very general information that really reflect the meat of the Conservation Directive provisions in the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. So title holder must be given notice, including the type of interest or estate that's affected, the purpose, and a copy of the Conservation Directive, a notification that you can apply for compensation, and the right to go to Queen's Bench instead of the Compensation Board, as I mentioned. So you only have a right to apply. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are immediately entitled to compensation. As I mentioned, title holders can apply, so that includes those who own fee simple title, an occupier, or a person with an estate or interest on the records of land titles, or a department administering the land. So that could be a notation that a department has on a piece of public land. It could be a conservation easement. It could be any of those things. It does exclude mineral leaseholders, primarily because some of this is dealt with through other processes. Interestingly, the compensation application has to be put to the government within 12 months from notice of the Conservation Directive. So there is a timeline or a time limitation to the compensation process. If it's determined that you're entitled to compensation, it's basically the assessment of the decrease in market value. So one could contemplate, again, like a conservation easement, it might be only certain rights related to the land that are restricted. So then there would be an assessment process outlined for that. There's also the notion of damage to injurious affection resulting from a conservation directive, and that basically means that it recognizes that restrictions can have kind of collateral effects on surrounding landscapes. So if you have a parcel of land and a conservation directive is on part of it, and it impacts the use of the rest of the land, then there may be damages or a decrease in value that you can claim there. Basically, the Crown decides whether it is payable. If there's a disagreement around the amount, you can go to the Land Compensation Board or Alberta Court of Queen's Bench. And the amount payable, which we'll discuss a bit more, is by the provincial government. So this is should have some appeal to municipalities insofar as the costs are borne by the provincial government, although we'll talk about how there's some cost sharing there. So here we have the new Canadian money. I hear it's coming out soon, but perhaps not. But part of ALSA also has a provision whereby it says Cabinet is responsible for establishing, supporting, and facilitating funding and cost sharing initiatives to support and enhance conservation directives. So there is provision to allow for cost sharing around these things, but we again need to find a way to get higher amounts of clarity around there. This power to develop these cost sharing initiatives and funding can be delegated to the stewardship minister, which is an important aspect. The Cabinet may not be the best place to deal with these issues, so there may be an opportunity there as well. MBI stands for market-based instruments. The Land Stewardship Act does indicate that pilot programs can take place around some of these market-based instruments. Any tax-based measures that are put in place have to be approved by Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance, which just adds that layer of oversight. So regulations. they need to be beamed up. There's a whole host of regulations that have yet to be put in place. That's not to say that we shouldn't throw up our hands and not seek further clarity, I think, from the province. I think working together, we could move a lot of the conservation directive initiatives forward. Regulations have to do with almost every aspect of conservation directives, from the process to applying, notification, land compensation board process, quantifying compensation, what's included, what's excluded from compensation specifically, terms and conditions that it can attach to conservation directives, enforcement of conservation directives. There is a provision that allows for the delegation of enforcement to qualified organizations or local authorities. So that's one aspect as well. Registration on land titles is also an important area where regulations are required. And probably most importantly, in my view, amendments and terminations or repealing of conservation directives. Insofar as it's in a regional plan, it basically requires cabinet to approve it. One must assume then that the termination process is going to maintain the discretion of cabinet to repeal these conservation directives. Of course, that raises a bunch of questions about what about the compensation that was paid to put the conservation directive in place. And again, the purpose, as stated, is around permanently protecting these features. So there's a variety of question marks there as well. As well as identifying who the title holder is. In terms of municipal authority itself, so except for the conservation directive restrictions itself, which do basically bind, or they can bind municipal development of certain areas. So the directive itself may have some implications for municipal development at a broader scale, but the process and rights outlined in ELSA do not detract from the powers of Part 17, the planning powers of the Municipal Government Act. That is to say, municipalities can still play that role of managing by bylaw, regulating the land uses, development permits, discretionary and permitted uses, all those types of things are untouched by the notion of a conservation directive. Which does obviously beg some interesting questions insofar as if a conservation directive is very general and doesn't really target some issues that the municipality might want to deal with in their planning process, then there's going to be some interesting overlap there and perhaps more stringent municipal government regulations compared to the conservation directive itself. So how are they differing from some of the existing tools? They can be imposed. They're approved by cabinet. Obviously, that's kind of viewed as a heavy-handed way to deal with things, and perhaps that's not how they will move forward in an ideal situation. Cabinet may require a list of candidate areas, and there's consultation on regional plans generally, although that doesn't necessarily mean that conservation directives specifically have to be consulted on. It's a major tool for the province for conservation purposes. If we look at Public Lands Act and regulations under that act, it's really not focused necessarily on conservation. There are opportunities under there, but really the conservation tool, it's really focused on conserving the values that we spoke of earlier. It's enforceable against the Crown and individuals. So unlike some tools like conservation easements, assuming that you're not entering a conservation easement with the Crown issuing the easement, then really the ability to control Crown action on lands is quite limited. Also, there's limited discretion to authorize things that are contrary to the intent and purpose of the conservation directive. So it is a strong tool once it's in a regional plan, and obviously it's going to require some clear wording in the directive itself to determine how it will be enforced, just like a conservation easement, I would argue. So how about compared to conservation reserves, the new Municipal Government Act tool? I think In this way, it's almost like a battle between Spock and Kirk, perhaps. Uh, one might be a bit more rational and logical, whereas one might have fewer barriers to move forward. So conservation reserves under the Municipal Government Act, there's an ownership change. Fundamentally, that's quite different. This isn't a provincial zoning type of issue. It's basically the municipalities getting ownership. It's municipal dollars being spent. It's municipal enforcement and monitoring. So obviously, this is a lot about money. Fair market value for fee simple is basically the approach that the conservation reserve process takes. Although at the positive end, there's no need to get cabinet involved, which is definitely a plus. Conservation directives, on the other hand, no ownership change occurs. Provincial money is the driver, but obviously, as we've mentioned, there may be cost-sharing agreements that are possible, which is an interesting concept. Provincial monitoring and enforcement. So there's money issues at play there. There's also the ability to rely on provincial enforcement. But as I mentioned, that can be delegated to a local authority if that's the chosen route to take. The amount is determined by the government itself, although that's going to be open to appeals and negotiations. But it may be related to an interest that is less than fee simple, and therefore the amount may be significantly less, or at least somewhat less, more reflecting a conservation easement type of approach. As well as, just to reiterate that the last slide noted that it can prohibit crown interests as well. So mineral tenure, oil and gas development. So it is a more broadly applicable provision and perhaps restriction on land use. So if we switch gears and think of municipal planning and how conservation directives fit in, the top kind of grouping of these things here are kind of all the planning tools that we have on the go, or at least the primary ones. They're not the only ones, unfortunately. So we have intermunicipal development plans, probably have increased in importance since the Municipal Government Act amendments. Area structure plans, municipal development plans, regional plans. Obviously, we have growth management boards and other regional boards that may play a role in this planning process, which raises a bunch of questions. So we have a variety of plans here. I mean, we could add probably another 10 layer of planning over top of that. But then we have to look at implementation. And when we look at environmental outcomes, really there's a variety of options. There's the directives themselves that we've been speaking of, conservation easements, environmental reserves, or municipal reserves, or conservation reserves as we have now, TDCs or tradable development credits, and then of course there's always the zoning power, which is quite broad and may even get additional clarity if some of the suggested amendments on municipal purposes on environmental stewardship are put in place. And really, I think when we look at implementation, we have to recognize that depending on the objectives we're after, it's going to change the tool that we want to use. Conservation easements are a bit of ones where we might use them in a variety of processes. So they may be in tradable development credit systems or even in zoning and development planning processes as well. The directives are similar as to easements, but they don't grant an interest in land, and they're, as I mentioned, provincial kind of land use zoning provisions. So if we get into the barriers then, what are the primary barriers? Obviously, there's a policy vacuum is probably the biggest barrier at this stage. Perceptions of centralized planning, as I mentioned earlier as well, have to be overcome. There was a lot of debate and discussion both in the legislature and outside of it around the strong language in the Alberta Land Stewardship Act and concerns private landowners had around that. The question around regional plans is ongoing, I think. We have an inkling of what we're planning to do, but we're still waiting for the inking on some of these plans to come to fruition. Very much a concern. Compensation may result in a major chilling effect in terms of municipal planning and conservation planning and protection. And really, it all comes down to we haven't done it yet, so people are going to be wary of all the variety of risks that are at play. But there are a lot of opportunities. There's a variety of integrated planning opportunities I see with conservation directives. They can span multiple municipalities. They can deal with municipal goals and public land, provincial public land goals. They can support private efforts in certain areas of the province where those efforts are broader, large-scale efforts. They can deal with agricultural issues that I think have been really kind of put off for a long time to deal with. We saw conservation easement purposes expand to include agricultural purposes, but still we haven't had a lot of discussion as a province or as municipalities about how we can conserve agricultural land into the longer term future. And then obviously wildlife corridors are another opportunity. So piloting the conservation directives, if we rely on Sulu and Chekhov to drive us where we need to go, I would say we need to focus on a voluntary adoption. So really getting together with the provincial government, other municipalities, other concerned citizens even, in terms of assessing and planning around what we want to see these conservation directives used for. There's the ability to, cost share around these things. And obviously, I think that will be or needs to be a primary focus. Frankly, the provincial aspect of these tools may be a good tool to get municipalities that may have differing planning outcomes or planning intentions to a table to discuss some of these things. And really, from a municipal point of view, I think it's important to realize that it's a mechanism to minimize or mitigate liability risks and planning and monitoring risks around some of these things that we view as a public good. Some of the pilots that the Environmental Law Center has targeted is certainly eastern slopes. So way back in the day, I think then Minister Ted Morton was of the view that we could protect a view shed of the eastern slopes. Headwaters or water tower protection is also one of the areas where we can use conservation directives. Rangelands and grasslands, wildlife corridors such as the Canmore corridor that is pictured there. So there are a variety of opportunities for conservation directives, but again, I think the regulation and policy barriers or vacuum, they aren't barriers, it's just a need to get going on them and fleshing out what the process for developing these plans and directives are. So I would argue it's time to go where no one has gone before and live long and have a prosperous environment. And without further ado, that is my rapid fire conservation directives.
Okay, Jason, thanks very much. I was capturing questions as well.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Guy.
I was just saying I was capturing questions as we were going along, and I thought maybe I could just fire them at you in order. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay, the first one was, is there any set minimum or maximum of the amount for a conservation directive?
Not that I'm aware of. There doesn't seem to be a minimum. Is that related to the monetary amount or the geographic amount, or it would have to be restricted geographically to a regional plan or a specific regional plan, although you could put them together in a mosaic of regional plans as well. So, but I'm not aware of any minimum or maximum.
Okay, I was just trying to go back to find out the person who asked that question. I think it was land area.
Yeah. So there doesn't appear to be any geographic or land area restrictions on conservation directives. So
Okay.
you could, yeah.
The next question was whether there are any conservation directives identified in the North Saskatchewan Regional Plan.
The North Saskatchewan Regional Plan, if anyone's seen it, please pass it along because I haven't seen it yet. So we don't know yet. There may be opportunities there, but again, I think part of the difficulty is in doing it in conjunction with development of regional plans at this stage is we have no precedent, so I think it's going to be a strong hesitation and risk aversion to imposing one. And without getting a broader discussion going, it would always be viewed, or I could even say spun, as being imposed as opposed to a negotiated and voluntary approach.
So, Jason, just to be clear, there are no conservation directives in existence or proposed within any regional plans. Is that correct?
There's none in existence, and I don't believe there are any proposed. But I'm not privy to the, so we could ask Cabinet, but is anyone from Cabinet on the line?
The next question was about any information that you have about how WPACs or municipalities so far, given that they don't exist, but so far their views on conservation directives?
So we haven't done a lot of work in terms of gathering information and perspectives on conservation directives. A lot of the work we've done is to understand some of the background intent. So talking to people like Ted Morton, who had been instrumental in including the tool of conservation directives, but we haven't really canvassed a lot of municipalities about that. But I think it's an important step for sure. Because of the cost sharing ability and the ability to have just partial estate interests in land, I think there's an opportunity there that we don't necessarily see with the other tools. But we'll have to see.
Okay. The next question was around the connection to the Species at Risk Act or emergency orders. If there's any use or potential use of the conservation directives in regard to that for listed species.
Well, that's an interesting question. I do think that they could use conservation directives to meet the intent and purposes of the Species at Risk Act federally. So they certainly could use conservation directives as a mechanism to implement restrictions, for instance, on habitat destruction, which we don't have really good tools otherwise. So conservation directives certainly could be used as a mechanism to do that. Either through a conservation agreement process under Species at Risk Act, which haven't been really used that much, but just as an example of how provincial governments are effectively protecting habitat of species at risk, I think that would certainly play into any type of federal review of provincial action. So I think they're highly relevant.
Okay. Sort of related to that, both these questions came from someone who's tuning in from BC. She noted their ability to impose easements, also mentioned restrictive covenants, and noted that the compensation part of that is problematic. And I think just looking for comment on that, or the experience in Alberta with this tool relative to the BC situation. So what Pamela noted specifically was we can impose easements and restrictive covenants which can be used for conservation purposes, but typically just for riparian areas and fisheries. They're problematic and there is not compensation that I know of.
Right. So it's viewed probably more contentiously. I can't speak too much to the BC example, but in terms of some of the restrictions you've mentioned, I think the value of conservation directives is is first and foremost is that the compensation is part of the process, and the tool itself can be used across landscape types and really foster broader landscape scale conservation efforts, which would be more difficult, I think, with an easement or a restrictive covenant approach, just in terms of how you'd have to deal with multiple landowners and that type of thing. But other than that, I'm not sure if I could comment any more on the BC situation.
I had a question related to that, and since I've got control of the mic, I guess I get to throw this in. But as you noted there, is this a fair assessment that conservation directives are possibly better used for or were conceived for large landscape kinds of conservation needs, like wildlife corridors across a large area and that sort of thing, versus other tools?
I certainly see it that way. I was nodding there if no one noticed. But, yes. So I think the concept and the fact that they were embedded in the regional planning process is recognizing a couple of things, both at the landscape scale. So you could make a conservation directive over multiple private land uses if you wanted to. But I think more specifically, it was a tool that flagged provincial intent on public land to preserve certain aspects and reduce conflicts in that way. So I think probably if I were to imply an intent, I think recognizing some of that the public land management is difficult, but if you had a conservation directive, it would become more clear and everybody would be driving in the same direction then, which we don't see now in terms of public land management.
So another question came up. You talked about the application of conservation directives as a land conservation tool, but one of the questions was, can it be used for conservation of aquatic resources, aquatic areas?
Good question. It's not one I've necessarily contemplated, but I don't see why not. I think you basically can tailor your conservation directive insofar as aquatic resources are highly dependent on kind of how we manage both public land under permanent water bodies, but also how we manage our uplands for water quality and other issues and fisheries and all these other things. I think it is well suited to all those things, to preserve habitat or to deal with water quality issues. I think conservation directives are a good tool for that.
Okay. Another question, you talked about the role of municipalities throughout your presentation, but specific question about if a conservation directive is part of a regional plan, what would the role of the municipality be? Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think I think what the discussion needs to be on a broader conservation and kind of that ecological planning lens on things, and then early engagement with the province. If there is a broader scale municipal view of certain landscapes, I think that's where we need to start some of these pilot projects. The province should be eager to do that as well in terms of doing it in a voluntary sense and getting broader consultation. Obviously, if it impacts private lands or other title holders, there's going to be a variety of issues that arise. So it is a bit daunting, but I think some of the broader scale things that I think many Albertans agree upon, specifically around eastern slopes management or different things, it's an essential early planning discussion that has to take place, and really finding the opportunities. We won't know until we start the discussion.
So I'm going to skip over a question but come back to that, because this one I think is specific to what you just said. Would a watershed scale be a good planning framework or planning scale, I think, for conservation directives?
Certainly, and I guess the difficulty then is layering on what type of management structure that the conservation directive would impose, and whether or not how many land managers are active on the landscape is one of the issues that might arise in that watershed scale application. Because really, if you're looking at areas where there's a lot of private landowners, then it's going to be more contentious, and the amount of upfront work will be quite difficult to do. Whereas public land, I mean, is a lot easier. In that way, it could be used as a riparian management tool as well, right? So, which may be less contentious.
The question I jumped over was, what's the experience of other jurisdictions with conservation directives?
So in our review of other experiences, there's not many places that have this type of tool. And where they do have the tool, it has varied effect, I'd say. So really, Alberta, in terms of North America, it's a primary example of a novel tool. So I guess we just have to establish it as our excellent opportunity and tool to move forward. So.
Okay. Another one I wanted to ask, you made a comment at one point about our slide about the regulations that need to be put in place, and other tools in ELSA have a similar kind of, here's a list of all the things we could make regulations on but haven't yet. Transfer development credits as an example. What's your thought on, do the regulations need to be put in place, or is it it would be good to have them, or they don't need to be put in place?
I would, for conservation directives specifically, I think there's probably a higher need for regulations to be put in place just to have an understanding of the compensation process, and specific to that, how things might be amended or terminated.
Right.
I mean, TDC programs aren't reliant on cabinet reviews of regional plans. So that aspect of it raises a lot of questions that I think require some regulatory clarity. Otherwise, everybody is going to be fumbling a little bit in terms of understanding how much things are worth, what the level of permanency is really, even though it says permanently protecting or managing these things. So there are probably too many questions to proceed too far without some level of kind of regulatory framework. That being said, I think probably smaller scale pilots may be feasible to kind of see how a system could work.
Okay. The next question is, in the case where a conservation directive is not identified in a regional plan, would that necessitate a full public engagement process in order for a cabinet to put one in?
That's a good question. So I think there's an open question there in terms of how one could perhaps put in a conservation directive later on in an amendment of a regional plan or as a sub-regional plan. The focus of the consultation is quite vague, so it's not very prescriptive in the Land Stewardship Act about what that consultation has to include or exclude, per se. So I think that is an open question. I think the risk, of course, is that if you attempt to have a conservation directive and there's those who are opposed to it, they may challenge that prospect or that approach because there are, in my view, there's a level of uncertainty there whether quote unquote consultation is required. But I think it is vague enough that you could include conservation directives subsequent to a cabinet process.
Okay. I don't think I've missed any questions that folks had put forward, but if I did miss your question, can you please note that in the chat? And just while I'm waiting for that, Jason, I wonder if you could elaborate on, I thought it was interesting, you said that the focus on voluntary adoption is probably a key approach, and I think a lot of folks view the conservation directive as purely a prescriptive thing, whereas other things are voluntary. Can you maybe just elaborate on that, what focusing on the voluntary adoption would look like?
Well, I think, as I've mentioned I think it needs to be a negotiation more than anything. Kind of identifying targets or objectives from a planning scale, and then moving towards an agreement, whether that's a cost sharing agreement or otherwise, but moving towards an agreement of landscape objectives. And that's where I see the tremendous value of municipalities engaging with the provincial government. Granted, the provincial government, I think, has to focus on identifying what their objectives for conservation directives are in specific regions if they have any. So it really does require full buy-in from all parties, because I think otherwise to impose a directive, with the exception of maybe some smaller areas of land, as people mentioned, for species at risk, I think the political barriers to conservation directives are likely too high to effectively use them otherwise. That being said, I mean, I am a firm believer that there are opportunities out there for conservation directives.
Right. Okay, great. I don't see any more questions showing up in the chat box, so we're pretty near on time. I think what we'll do is finish up, and first of all, thank you to Jason for. And I really like it when I present before Jason, because he's got all these great Star Trek references that I just make my presentations look boring. But thanks very much, Jason, for this. And as was mentioned before, the webinar has been recorded. The link for the recording will be sent out. And if you are interested in getting a PDF copy of the slides, we can make that available as well. And the last thing is tune in next week, so Tuesday, February 14th, a great way to spend Valentine's Day. Dave Polton will be talking about conservation offsets, and that will be the last in the presentation of 4. So with that, we'll sign off, and thanks very much, Jason and the Environmental Law Center, for presenting this webinar.
Well, thank you for everybody attending, and let's go where no one has done before.